Anybody who has been a church-going follower of Jesus for long enough will eventually encounter the accusation that you Christians need to be more like your Jesus. He was just this really chill dude who encouraged people to love each other and to stop being so judgmental, which is another way of saying that the Jesus that is represented in the church and its doctrines and in the Bible isn't anything like the original. The original was mild-mannered, unfailingly kind, and maybe even a little bit sentimental. But at some point, the church obscured the real Jesus behind rigid dogmatism, exclusivity, and excessive legalism. Now, Jesus did say and do a lot to promote the concerns of the excluded, the poor, and the forgotten. He promoted love and acceptance for all, even that most unlikely of all classes, the rich and the powerful. But he also taught a lot of other things by word and example. That if someone were to read the Gospels objectively, as though for the first time, they wouldn't come away with a sense that he was this chill dude who was exclusively concerned with everyone just getting along. If someone were really to read the Gospels for the first time or as objectively as they possibly could, they would likely come away with a portrayal of Jesus that was confusing and mystifying. They would find someone who spoke with unprecedented authority, as if he was representing all concerned parties of the world. They would encounter someone who can speak and act so delicately and mercifully in one instance, and with the full weight of blind, pitiless justice in another. When I first became convinced that God was real and that Jesus was a possible ingredient within his interactions with humanity, who alone he apparently imbued with a rational soul, as far as we know, I decided to read the Gospels for myself without any tradition or affiliation to inform that reading. And one of the first things I noticed about the Gospels of the New Testament was their apparent lack of the kind of utility that would inform most human motivations. With the Gospels, there are two explanations that you can arrive at when you encounter them. One is that the people who are telling this story, that is the early followers of Jesus, that they are sincere and truly believe what they claim about the experience of knowing and following him. The other is that they were just lying and inventing the whole story, possibly for some motive that we haven't determined yet. You could also claim, if you were so inclined, that they had all experienced mass simultaneous hallucinations and psychosis, but there really isn't any precedent for such an explanation. So if we're honest, we would have to stick to the first two alternatives. So if you take the latter position, that is that they were lying, you have to ask yourself, why would they do that? People don't lie for the fun of it, especially if they know that it will get them into trouble with the authorities, which is exactly what happened to the apostles. All of them, with the exception of just one, were executed for their persistence in telling this story. Now, you would only take those kinds of risks if you estimate that you will gain something, some higher gain out of that transaction. There must be some utility in the lie. For example, when people are arrested and accused of a crime, they will often lie because they are motivated by a desire to escape punishment and to preserve their freedom. And so they tell stories of what actually happened, which are, of course, stories that aren't true. And stories that, if you can anticipate the motive for why they might tell this particular story, they aren't very difficult to poke holes in and reveal for the lies that they contain. And this is an aspect of human psychology that we can all relate to some degree because we've all done it. The truth is often more strange and enigmatic than our attempts to fabricate our own approximations with an alternative, that is, a lie. Lies are composed of what a little finite human brain can conceive of as an alternative reality, which, when compared and placed in contrast to the vastness of actual reality, or the truth for that matter, it tends to look like a pitiable and unlikely thing and is therefore really easy to detect for what it is, especially if you can anticipate the motives for why someone would actually tell that lie. But what we find in the New Testament is a very curious account full of riddles and things you wouldn't say if you were trying to establish a new religious cult from scratch. For example, if you were trying with every measure of your effort to inspire the acquiescence of your hearers to adopt your claims as truth, knowing the danger of doing so and what it would pose to your safety, you wouldn't do things like leave a massive gap in the narrative from the time that Jesus was a child to when he suddenly reemerges as a mature adult. And we know this would be a natural motive for someone trying to construct a story, because whenever filmmakers try to depict the life of Jesus, they will often try to fill that gap with apocryphal tales of what he must have been like as a child. But they don't do that in the Gospels because they don't know what happened and they aren't willing to go beyond their own knowledge, which isn't the kind of restraint a liar would impose on themselves. If you were inclined to make up a story or a mythology of this nature, you might want to downplay the perplexing things that Jesus does and the apparent dichotomy, and even some might say the dual nature that is apparent within him, and which can be startling to any person who reads the Gospels for the first time. Where in one instant he can show the most merciful concern for the heartbreak and brokenness of humanity, and then in another, the most wrathful condemnation against hypocrites and those who fail to observe the fundamental laws of God. How he can condemn all manner of sin and implore those that he heals and forgives to sin no more, and then treat some of the most detestable sins as if they were of little consequence in comparison to his tender mercy. How he can say in one moment, "Peter, do you love me? And if so, feed my lambs." And then in another exchange to the very same person, "Get behind me, Satan, for you are thinking not as God does, but as human beings do." In your first reading, you might be left wondering, who the heck are Mark and Luke, and why are their accounts among the most important, considering that they don't even appear in the main narrative? If you were going to manufacture this narrative and these documents, and of course their authorship, you would want to choose authors whose credibility would be the most easily recognized. You'd call them the Gospels of Peter, James, and John and Matthew. At least they were all there. You wouldn't choose these other characters to represent the most important synoptic accounts of these events unless you were willing to sacrifice the kinds of qualities that people would expect to see to be believed. And that's just it. Lies are always composed of things we would expect to see. It's a deliberate attempt on the part of the deceiver to tap into our expectations, to persuade us to believe them. The truth often defies our expectations. But it seems fairly obvious that the people who were telling the story of Jesus were making sacrifices to what would be common human preferences to make the story more accessible, more agreeable, and less enigmatic. As G.K. Chesterton points out, the Gospels are full of riddles, just as the truth is full of riddles. If it were not, it would be too easy to accuse of being a mere human invention. Even if you dispute the accounts of the Gospels, one thing that virtually every scholar, whether they're Christian or non-Christian, agrees upon is that the historical person, Jesus of Nazareth, was executed by crucifixion under Pontius Pilate in the reign of Tiberius, who was the Roman emperor, for stirring up controversy, both religious and political, among the people. In short, Jesus was a troublemaker through and through. He did not find himself in that position for being a laid-back drifter guru. And for anybody who has been a church-going Catholic for any length of time, you'd be hard-pressed to hear a sermon that portrays Jesus as anything other than meek and merciful. The church consistently prefers to turn the face of merciful Jesus to its public. In the 15 years or so that I've been Catholic, I've rarely heard a pastor preach about same-sex marriage, abortion, or hell, or any other doctrine of the church that would endorse a lot of those stereotypical accusations that come from its critics. If you go to a Catholic church, you will see statues of Jesus and his Sacred Heart. You will never see a statue of Jesus where he is consumed with wrath while cleansing the temple from the money changers, violently, I might add. You will see icons of Jesus' merciful gaze towards the sinner, but never depicting Jesus staring down the Pharisees who he accused of being hypocrites and whitewashed tombs and vipers. In fact, there is a mosaic that is depicted, I think, in the dome of the National Shrine Cathedral in Washington, D.C., that does depict a bit of a more intimidating figure of Jesus, and it's so notable, and the reason I know of it is because of how unusual it is. While the church has many faults, or at least her members do, preferring a harsh and unsympathetic God to the plights of humanity is not something that you can accuse the church of. In fact, the exact opposite is a far better account of the truth. Although the church does preserve the full spectrum of these stories and of all of her traditional doctrines, you have to be an enthusiastic inquirer to go and dust off those doctrines and compare them to the sentiments of the day, because you won't often hear them enthusiastically proclaimed from the pulpit. And so from my experience, I think it's a really strange and curious thing that this most prominent and consistent criticism of the church is the exact opposite of the truth. You always hear these accounts, especially from people who are former Catholics, of how guilty they always felt, when in fact, if the church is at fault, it's for overemphasizing the merciful stories of Jesus at the expense of the more difficult stories and accounts of his teachings. And it's a fault that she shares with the very same critics who object to anything other than that depiction. Perhaps those criticisms are motivated by a desire to disassociate themselves from the church when there is so much that does in fact associate them with it. Now, at the time that I'm recording this video, it's actually Easter, which is a time that we should be able to re-encounter the story of Jesus, and especially the climax of the story of Jesus, again, hopefully for the first time, which is something that is really hard to do when 2,000 years of history and scholarship, as well as opposition, stand between us and that story. It's hard not to get distracted by what everyone else has to say about the story and then fail to encounter it for ourselves. So that would be my challenge to you. Take that very same opportunity, at least for your own integrity, if nothing else, because you don't have to look far to get a strongly felt opinion about Jesus, the Bible, and the church. But in my experience, you do have to look very hard to find someone who has actually read the thing for themselves. And if you want to be someone who has a legitimate opinion, as apparently most people are, and if you want to have an opinion that aligns with the truth of the matter, then take the time to familiarize yourself with the real thing. You may discover, as I did, that it is full of surprise and full of wonder, that it defies many of the accusations that are made against it, and that it contains much more nuance in the range than the range that opinions and commentaries will usually allow. Thanks for watching. The reason I can continue making content like this is because of the generous support of my viewers. If you feel called to support this work, then consider joining the Reinforcements, which is my online community. There are multiple tiers, including free access for those who can't help financially but still want to join. You can join up at www.brianholdsworth.ca. Certain levels will also get a free gift basket from Glory and Shine, who is a family-owned Catholic bath and body products company whose beard balm I'm wearing right now. It's like aromatherapy for your face. Even if you don't join, they make amazing products, so check them out at gloryandshine.com. And don't forget to like and subscribe. You don't have to agree with everything I said to get value out of these kinds of conversations, so be sure to subscribe to be edified or challenged. There's value in both.
Pray, brethren, that my sacrifice and yours may be acceptable to God the Almighty Father. May the Lord accept the sacrifice at your